Well, turning now to the coronavirus and some good news. China is reporting a decrease in the number of new cases for the third day in a row. But the death toll in the country where the virus began is now nearing 3,000. In other developments, Italy's death toll has jumped by nearly 50% to 79. Meanwhile, Iraq, Poland, Chile and Argentina have reported their first cases of COVID-19. And Australia's largest supermarket chain is rationing sales of, get this, toilet paper after panic buying hit stores in recent days. Meanwhile, criticism is growing of the U.S. government for failing to quickly implement effective testing for the pathogen. Knowing if a sick person is infected with the virus is the first step in determining who needs to be quarantined. Our next report looks at a testing method developed here in Berlin and now being used across the world.
Determining whether or not someone has the coronavirus isn't as simple and straightforward as it sounds. The process generally begins when a patient complains of symptoms like fever or a dry cough. The challenge is distinguishing a COVID-19 infection from the flu or other respiratory conditions because the symptoms are so similar. Testing begins with a swab sample, usually taken from the mouth or nose, although experts believe mucus coughed up directly from the lungs is a better indicator. Many of the various tests use a method known as the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. It works like this. If a sample contains the coronavirus, the chemicals in a test kit begin to react with its unique genetic material and start copying it over and over again. The copies are tagged with a dye, so even when low loads of virus are in a sample, they grow more and more detectable with each new generation of copies. One such test for the coronavirus was developed in Berlin back in January by Dr. Christian Drosten and his team. It can take several hours to get a positive or a negative result.
Labs will look at our recipe, order some specific ingredients that they will receive after like 2 days. At the same time, order this molecule for us that they will also receive within very short time. And then they can start testing.
In the last few weeks, the WHO has sent some 250,000 of Drosten's PCR kits to labs across the planet. The means to detect the virus quickly will play a vital role in combating it effectively. But in parts of the world like Africa, the technology is still far from common.
Derek Williams was the author of that piece. He joins me now in studio for more on coronavirus testing. I mean, first of all, how big is the gap between the demand for these tests and the availability of these tests?
Well, that depends very much on where you are. China has reported that they're now producing and carrying out upwards of 1.5 million tests a day.
A day?
A day.
Wow, okay.
Sorry, a week.
A week.
In the course of a week. South Korea would be the next country that's tested the most number of people. There are over 100,000 people that they've tested so far. They've set up these drive-through centers where you can actually drive your car up and
get tested from your car.
Tested from your car, which actually helps cut down on the infection rate among the people who are actually conducting the tests. Italy is upwards of 20,000 tests right now. But of course, the other big hotspot, Iran, we don't really have a lot of numbers there about the implication would be that there's not a lot of people getting tested there. And interestingly, also in the U.S., as we heard earlier in the show, there's also in the hundreds.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. I mean, what's going on there? We heard about this major scandal right now involving testing for the coronavirus in the United States.
Right. It's really the Centers for Disease Control seem to have really dropped the ball. It really bungled this pretty badly. It has to do with the way that it's set up. The way that it's set up in the States is that first the virus gets isolated by the CDC, and then the methods get developed by the CDC, and then they pass that along to commercial developers. And they've never made it past that second stage yet. They've had to sort of jump over it. The FDA is not allowed to approve testing that hasn't come from the CDC. And so
they couldn't use, for example, this test from Berlin.
Well, they possibly could, but the way that it's set up in terms of the regulations in the States, the FDA has to approve it. They're now doing that. The U.S. has said that by the end of next week, there's going to be about 1 million test kits available and that they're going to be testing people. There's some skepticism about that, a lot of outrage in the American media, a lot of frustration.
What if someone has caught the virus they've recovered from it. Could a test then later detect, okay, this is a person who had the virus at one point?
No, this is testing for an active infection. And what you're talking about is a serological test. So that's a blood test that checks to see whether or not you have produced the antibodies. The antibodies are these proteins produced by the immune system, whether you've produced the antibodies that fit with a coronavirus. And that's something, though, that is important information to have in the long term for a number of different reasons, not least because we believe that many people who have it have very mild symptoms or might even be asymptomatic. So being able to prove retrospectively that somebody has had it or not had it is going to, for example, allow us to define things like the fatality rate in this disease. But it's also going to allow us to do things like draw links between clusters of infections that with somebody that might have silently carried it from one to the other, not even knowing that they were ill.
So knowledge is power. The more testing we can do, the more numbers we have, the better. But where do we go from there? How do we start to use that information? How do we continue to battle the spread of the coronavirus?
Well, what's been very interesting for me watching the discourse on this over the last couple of months is that we've moved away from, the whole idea has been containment, containment, containment. We need to do what we did with SARS. We need to shut it down at the source as quickly as we possibly can, and then it just goes away. But so the WHO is continuing to say we need to contain this disease, but the only place that it's actually, that could arguably be said to have contained the disease so far is China. And of course, they've done it with these draconian measures that are not going to work in other parts of the world. And so you have, they're also, the question is how long is this hiatus? How long is it going to continue? Could there be a second wave of infections with people bringing it back to China sometime in the near future? And so we've moved away in this discourse away from the idea of containment towards what's called mitigation, which is that experts are beginning to say, I think that we have to accept that this is going to be endemic. Where do we go from here in terms of preparations? And where do we move forward in the future in terms of planning for this?
Derek Williams with DW Science, thank you very much.
With the economic damage caused by the coronavirus becoming increasingly clear, more and more companies are calling for state aid. Some governments have already responded with a variety of measures. South Korea, for example, is to deliver an economic stimulus package to the tune of $13.7 billion. The cash is mainly aimed at smaller businesses like the country's numerous market traders who have been badly affected by the crisis. The United States has altered its monetary policy in an attempt to calm markets. In a surprise move, the Federal Reserve lowered the base rate by 0.5%, keeping interest rates between 1 and 1.25%. China, too, has implemented a range of measures to support its economy. Small businesses have been granted tax and social security payment cuts, as well as access to cheap loans. However, the government says there are no plans for a comprehensive stimulus package like the one delivered in 2008. Let's go straight to our financial correspondent in Frankfurt. Uli Bartz is there for us. Uli, more and more central banks are moving to help with the coronavirus crisis. What are you hearing from the ECB? Can we expect anything from them?
Yes, we can. President Christine Lagarde said that there would be appropriate and targeted action commensurate with the situation. So the ECB will do something. We just don't know what and when. Next week, there is a policy meeting with all the decision-making members that are going to be present. And that will be a good time, or would be a good time, to present a solution. If not until then, something is presented. What we're hearing is that it won't be a rate cut. The lending rate is already at 0 for banks, and the deposit rate is in negative territory. What we're hearing is that the ECB is looking at injecting cash into small and medium-sized companies that have gotten into trouble over coronavirus, having to pay salaries, having to pay suppliers, landlords. But that sounds more like economic policy than monetary policy.
Uli, more and more voices are emerging saying that these measures are all premature, and some are even saying they are completely misguided. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's my take on that as well. I'm hearing that a lot from market participants, traders, analysts. I'd like to give you one voice, which I will read, which I think pretty well sums up the critics' arguments. It's from Frank Dixmeyer from Allianz, largest insurer in Europe, and he says that The intervention of central banks at this stage is useless, even unhealthy. A demand shock must be addressed by the fiscal policy in the countries. A supply shock is more complex, but it's not a rate cut that will be able to remedy that.
Uli Bartz there in Frankfurt. Thank you for this update. Well, the global economy stutters amidst the coronavirus outbreak and oil demand is sharply down. Prices are too. OPEC experts will come together in Vienna this week to discuss production cuts.
The virus has been paralysing economic activity and dragging on growth, especially in China. For weeks there, shops have been closed and assembly lines have stopped. Air transport is also badly affected in many places. Thousands of flights have been cancelled with no let-up in sight. Global oil consumption highlights the problem. As production lines and supply chains grind to a halt, demand for crude has fallen sharply. That's had an immediate effect on oil prices. They've fallen by 21% since the start of the year. They're currently floundering at 2.5-year lows. That's come as a shock to oil-producing countries. OPEC member countries are now thinking about throttling output again to try and boost the price and keep their government's revenues flowing.
With me in the studio now is Enjay Ayuk. He's the CEO of Centurion. That's a company that advises OPEC OPEC and oil companies. Enjay, how has Corona affected the oil market?
Thank you for having me. Corona has really affected the oil market where there's been a slowing demand and you're really seeing big issue. Prices have gone down. And let's say they were somewhere around hovering around 60. Right now, it's already around 50. And you're really seeing the market going crazy with what is going on with the coronavirus because there's very slowing demand, there's slowing jet fuel demand, and so it's really sending the market into crisis right now.
A big chunk of that slowdown in demand comes from China. Is that the main driver, China not needing so much oil at the moment? It's
one of many. I mean, you have right now a lot of industrial bases around India, around Europe, around the United States that people cannot get together. You have a lot of people staying home from big gatherings. So you're going to see a further decline, especially with jet fuel, especially with industrialization and manufacturing plants. So it's not just China. China is part of it, but it's going to be bigger. And right now it's even bigger than China. And that's what calls for a global concern on the coronavirus, especially with oil prices and the oil markets.
What can we expect from that Vienna meeting tomorrow?
OPEC is always a great place to be with the negotiations and the back and forth that happens. Right now, you have this big tent with OPEC Plus. So you're going to have to ask the big question: do we go on a 300,000 to 500,000 cut to really make sure that you stabilize the market so that consumers and producers can both live with? Are you going to work on the supply glut? That is what's going to happen. So you're going to see who wants a cut, who doesn't want a cut. But this Big Ten with Russia included really gives a chance that consumers can really not continue to feel the pinch, but also producers can feel that they can stabilize and grow the market.
So who will be for a production cut and who will be against it and why?
It really depends because, right now you already have a lot of production of the market, 800,000 barrels out of Libya, escalating sanctions against Venezuela. That's a lot of oil that's already out of the market. So it's left to be seen how Saudi Arabia, which is one of the biggest producers, together with Russia, how they can come together. I think there is right now a growing dynamic where the Russians don't really want to push for a cut, but they are going to have to in order to stabilize the market. And the Saudis are always open to having all this discussion. Most African states are small, and some of the non-OPEC states would have to also share in the pain to make sure that we all stabilize the market.
Enjay Ayuk, thank you very much for
Thank
this
you so much.
very interesting analysis. Beijing's decision to ban all group travel and stop package tourists from leaving China was hailed as a sensible step to contain the coronavirus. But it's hammered global tourism. Many destinations are relying on Chinese visitors these days, and especially local hotels and restaurants who specialize in catering for tourists from China are fighting to survive.
A light mist partially shrouds the fairy tale castle of Neuschwanstein. Bavaria's prime tourist attraction seems peacefully aloof. Visitor numbers have been tumbling steadily since the coronavirus outbreak. Neighbouring towns normally host 70,000 tourists a year from China. Overall, that's only about 5% of the people who visit this area. But for those hotels, restaurants and shops which have specialised in welcoming Chinese tour groups, the virus has quickly become a real problem.
Its effects are selective. It hits all the businesses, hotels and guest houses which work closely with the Chinese market, with Chinese group tours, for instance. They're feeling the loss of revenue very, very strongly, and it can't be compensated for at all in the short term.
Like this restaurant, which targets Chinese travel groups. It's now closed until further notice. And this eatery and hotel has also shut down for the time being. Companies tailor-made for Asian tourists are located here and around the castle. They include a range of businesses with pottery, watches and jewellery made in Germany, made in Switzerland. Fast-track shopping, tax-free and with a direct connection to Asian payment systems. Tourists, like these two, seem to have very little extra time on their hands.
Often they'll cover several countries inside 10 days. It's clear that sightseeing and shopping are on their agenda. When you can combine them both in one location, then that's a major time gain on the schedule and a huge advantage.
It's still too early to estimate losses. This four-star hotel has a broad customer base, serving tourists from all over the world. Less than 15% come from China, but the increasing number of cases which are appearing in other countries and the mounting number of travel restrictions could become a problem.
We've had a few cancellations due to the virus. Hasn't hit us too hard up to this point, and we're hoping it doesn't continue for any length of time, and at some point things will stabilize and get back to normal.
The high season is only around the corner. Everyone here is hoping that the situation will ease by then, even if that doesn't look likely right now.